Hello and welcome to another edition of From the Pastor's Heart. Today I'd like to talk with you about something that on the surface may seem a little bit strange. I'd like to talk to you about high places. And specifically, I want to look at what they are, and then I'm going to spend a couple of weeks actually talking, a couple of podcasts talking about the high places and the different things about them and so on. But the high places were a place in the Old Testament where people would go and they would worship their God. And so that they were primarily associated with the followers of some of the foreign gods. Baal and Molech and Asherah and others would have places where people would go and they would worship them. And so by the time the children of Israel go into Canaan, the idea of high places was something that was very prevalent. Now this is not something that was just invented here at the time that the children of Israel came into the land. In fact, we know that the high places have been around for a long time. I mean, Abraham, for example, went up to a high place to offer Isaac when God called him to do that. And so the idea of the high place is a place where you can get a little bit closer to God. So we might think of that as an outdoor church service. The problem is that they morphed after the Tower of Babel as this pantheon came in from Babylon, that the high places became a place where people would worship pagan altars. And so God told the children of Israel not to go to the high place. Now, up until the time the tabernacle was built, I mean, there was no other place to go, but God gave them the tabernacle so they would have some place where they would be able to experience the presence of God. Because it was in the tabernacle as they were wandering through the wilderness, and Exodus talks about how it was being built and so on, that the purpose for the tabernacle was to give the children of Israel a place where the presence of God was concentrated, and so that they would be able to walk in relationship with God. And that's where the sacrifices took place and so on in this movable worship center. And then when the children of Israel came into the land, the tabernacle was still there, but the tabernacle after a while came into where it ended up in someone's house and they stopped using it. And then people began to take on the practices of the people in Canaan, and they would build high places. Now they would build these high places and they would still worship Yahweh, but they would still worship on the high places. In fact, in Kings, in 1 Kings chapter 3, it tells us that the people were sacrificing at the high places, however, because no house had yet been built for the name of the Lord. So even though they had the tabernacle, there was no building. And so by the time Solomon comes on the scene, now remember, we've already had Saul as king, we've already had David as king, and now we have Solomon. And so Solomon was tasked by God to build the temple. And so now we have a building. And the building, it was a slaughterhouse. It was a beautiful slaughterhouse. It was made of gold. It had the glory of God on it, so it shone about. And it was pretty exciting to look at. But it was still, for the most part, a slaughterhouse. And then, but in the slaughterhouse, what made it different was the fact that God had concentrated his presence in this place. And so this was a place now where God told the children of Israel, I want you to come here and I want you to offer your sacrifices here. So every Jewish male was required by the law to come back to Jerusalem and to worship there. And they were to come at certain times of the year. They were to come for the Day of Atonement, for example. They were to come for the Passover, to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem. They were to stay there. They were to come back 40 days later for the Feast of Booths, what became known to us as Pentecost. There's places where they would be reminded of God's goodness and how God had taken care of them. And so these are places where God called them to come back. And so, but the problem was that sometimes going back to the temple was inconvenient. And so the first problem that we find with the high places, and this is with the average person, we're going to take a look at some others here as we go along, but was the fact that It was so much more convenient just for me to hire a Levite, because remember, you've got Levitical cities scattered throughout the nation. It was so much easier for me just to hire a Levite to come out and offer sacrifices for me and for my family. And so what happened was that there became this cottage industry of high places for Yahweh, that they would bring Levites to come in and to offer sacrifices there. Now, the problem with that was that God did not tell them to worship on the high places. In fact, he told them specifically not to worship on the high places, because that's what everybody else did. You are to be different. You are to go into Jerusalem and you are to worship me there. And so one of the dangers with a high place, and I'm going to use the high place as a metaphor. That and it was the first metaphor I want us to see was the high places were a place where you could have put convenience on the altar ahead of God. And I think that that's a danger for Christians, especially in our day and age. We live in with a ton of technological advances and so on. Do we really need to come to church on a Sunday and worship? Well, the Bible tells us yes. In Hebrews, it tells us not to forsake the gathering together of the elect, but as some are in the habit of doing. Even when it's difficult, he says, I still want you to come and I want you to worship me together. And though, yes, it's easier. It's easier to sit home and live stream and chill. That I don't need to get dressed up. I can wear my jammies. I can go to church and so on. And it's just more convenient. And now, we live stream our church service, we live stream our Sunday school, we live stream all of our teaching. So I'm not speaking against the medium, but what I am saying is this. If I can tell you this, if we ever got to the point where we had more people joining us online who live in Connecticut than people who live here, I would stop the live stream and I would just do the on-demand teaching. The live stream does serve a purpose. It serves a purpose when somebody is sick. They can stay home. They can still stay connected. They shouldn't be coming to church if they're not feeling well anyway. They don't want to be passing on germs. And so, but it's a great way to be able to log in and to see what's going on and be a part of the body. It's a great thing for when somebody's traveling. That we have some folks at our church who live in Florida part of the year. Can't wait for you guys to come back. You know who you are. And so it's kind of fun for me to look at the stream and I see that there's somebody from Florida. I know where they are, keeping an eye on things. It gives them a chance to stay connected with the body because this is still their church home. And so to know where the preaching is and so on, find out what's going on the announcements. And so it's a very good thing to happen. We have other folks who may be traveling in, they may be driving into church and so maybe have Sunday school on while they're getting ready because they're not coming to class, and then to get ready for worship. That's all that is definitely acceptable. There's no problem with that. When I was on vacation in Florida, on Sunday morning, I turned on the live stream. I wanted to find out kind of how things are going. Even when I'm at some other church, I should not admit this. I'll still turn on the live stream, keep the volume off, and it's a way for me to connect. So, but again, when it gets in the way, so I'm not talking about different places or different times. I'm talking about when we just going to do something because it's more convenient. And that's not just church. It could be, sometimes it's inconvenient to read the Bible. Sometimes it's inconvenient to pray. Sometimes it's inconvenient to do a lot of the things, maybe be involved in ministry. It's not always convenient to do a lot of the things that God calls us to do. But I would like to encourage you with this. I don't think it was convenient for Jesus to leave the comforts of heaven to come down to earth. I don't think it was convenient for him to be wrapped in the limitations of a human body. And he who had always been, who had never been tired, now inside a human body, we know he was tired. I'm sure that was inconvenient. I'm sure it was inconvenient for him to die on a cross. I'm sure it was inconvenient for him to bear the penalty and the weight of our sin and be judged by a holy, righteous God. I'm sure all of those things were inconvenient, but yet God inconvenienced himself when Jesus came down and tabernacled among us. Because the problem is this, folks, is that once we start down the slippery slope of the high place, and it starts off with just being convenient, but what we're going to find is that those high places that began as places where folks could worship Yahweh in just an easier way, they started to actually lead them away from God and actually leading them into the worship of the false gods and the demons of the people groups around them. And so one of the things that we see God calling with many of the kings who came to rise in Judah, there were no righteous kings in the northern kingdom of Israel. But in Judah, there were several righteous kings. There were some kings who loved the Lord. But one of the things it's always bothered me whenever I would read this is that you would hear that somebody had a heart for God, but they didn't take down the high places. Because for some reason, the kings were afraid of the people. That if I take away their convenience, then what are they going to think of me? And so because of that, they continued to allow people to decide for themselves what was right and wrong, which of course the Bible calls sin. And ultimately, these high places and allowing these high places to stay led the people back into slavery, slavery to these foreign gods, and allowed them to start worshiping them. It made it easier for them. And in fact, we know the one king that I know of who not only destroyed the high places, but also desecrated them, Josiah, also happened to have the lowest approval rating of all the godly kings of Judah because people didn't like it. And so I would encourage you today to ask yourself, are there high places in my life? We'll take a look at some other high places that have come into the church that we see from Scripture that I believe that we can extrapolate into our world today. But the first one I want us to take a look at, because this is the gateway drug, if you will, and that is the high place of convenience. That our job is to do what God has called us to do, whether it's convenient or not. Because if we don't, we'll start the slippery slope. And unfortunately, slippery slope arguments, nobody likes them because they always win. And ultimately, once we begin to compromise a little bit, it becomes easier and easier and easier. That's what we find in the life of the children of Israel. And unfortunately, I think we also have found that in the life of the church as well. So I pray that you are challenged by these words. I pray that you're encouraged. I pray that as you gather together with your siblings in Christ this week, and I pray that you would sense the presence of God in a powerful way, that as you respond back to Him with all that you are, I pray that you will be incredibly blessed. I look forward to seeing you again in a future video. God bless you all.